Achechele murao Uyeruna pilote tata kupindu Uyeruna 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 pilote tata kupindu Uyeruna Uyeruna pilote tata kupindu. No, comrades. Let me not charge you so harshly. On that note, thank you, comrades. I recognize the ones who followed through. In the spirit of the movement, I will close it there and say Amandla. And believe that the rest were singing with their hands. Comrades, we're here today to think together around making violence against women. What does that actually mean? We've done so many campaigns, we've done so much work, we've done so many interventions talking about the abbreviation VAW, violence against women. But what does it actually mean, to work in such a field? Or what structures can we think of when we think about that? So this conversation is meant to help us unpack in terms of what are some of the structures or what are some of the layers in the global and also in the national layer in thinking about this work and thinking about the interventions. But I'm also hoping more than anything else, it will allow us to reflect on ourselves and the approaches that we also adopt in the many different approaches that we engage in. So I'm hoping that you're not just going to sit and listen to our speakers today, but you will also be offering some of your own experiences, your own ideas, and also hopefully we can dream together for the near future. I will not say much. I'm just a timekeeper, glorified timekeeper. And today we have our main speaker is Professor Rashida Manjoo. Too intimidated to say much, and I'll hand over to my boss leader, my comrade leader, Michelle Festus, who's the Women's Rights Coordinator for ActionAid South Africa, to introduce Professor Rashida, and then we'll take it from there.
All right, thanks, Norma. Is it better if I say?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, I think my voice is loud enough. Thank you, Norma, and thank you everybody for coming, particularly our partners from the LRP. We've been talking about this for a long time, how to connect our local and national work to global work. It's very clear in our CSP talks about linking local to global. And I'm happy that, we all know that violence against women and girls is an issue for everybody in this country. So whether you're in an LRP, whether you're working in a project, whether you're in an urban area, it's an issue that concerns all of us. But now just to get to say something about Rashida, I know she was asked to introduce herself, but I've known her for a very long time. She doesn't like that kind of thing. So yeah, from my side, we're very honored and privileged, Rashida, to have you here. It's been long. I think I've been nagging on her net since 2013. Finally, now that she's left the UN, we managed to get her here. I've known Rashida since 1998. And I think, what stands out for me and why I struggle sometimes to find feminist leaders to look up to in this country, but Rashida has been one of those people that has been consistent in her politics, unwavering in her commitment to women's emancipation. And I think that's the kind of leadership that we need in this country. I have been inspired particularly by Rashida's work in the UN. I've been to the Commission on the Status of Women meetings over the last 3 years, and I've followed Rashida's work and where she has submitted reports to the UN on her different missions that she has done across many countries. And I'm particularly struck by the work that she's done there. She's been many other places, done lots of other things. I won't elaborate, but we are very honored to have Rashida here. She's also going to be going to ActionAid UK in December. I think it's part of the Fearless campaign that we've just been a part of. So I think I'll speak a little bit later, but just to say the context for why we're having this event. So ActionAid South Africa has signed up to the Safe Cities campaign, which is a multi-country campaign involving 25 ActionAid countries across the globe. Very specific focus of that campaign is about ending violence against women and girls and to ensure that women can be free of violence and the fear of violence and can have access to gender responsive services. So people often ask, gender responsive service, what is that? So about accessible, available services that actually speak to the needs and interests of women. And so a lot of, in fact, all of the work we do in the Women's Rights Program is linked to our Safe Cities campaign work. In our country strategy in 2013, we identified the issue of migration, that is a big issue, and urban poverty. And for that, we decided that we definitely needed to work on the issues of urban poverty and what happens in urban areas, but at the same time, keeping the link to rural development or underdevelopment, however we see it. So it's very important for us to link our work in the different spheres, whether it's on a national, whether it's on a local level, whether it's in urban, and whether it's in a rural area, because all of these issues are connected. And of course, violence, the Safe Cities campaign focuses on violence in public spaces, but we also know that there's a definite link, a continuum between the violence in the private sphere and the violence in the public sphere. And violence in our country and elsewhere has become very normalized across the world. And I think that's what's shocking. And yeah, so people also invite you to read in the folders. There's an opinion piece that I've written called Making Violence Against Women Unthinkable. And just to acknowledge from the outset, that was not my phrase. I did not coin it. It comes from a friend in the international women's movement called the Courts of Women, Corinne Kumar. And I think it's a kind of dream and visioning that we need at this point in time. We often want to give up because of the pandemic levels of violence against women in this country, because of the brutality. But I believe if we do not have that kind of vision, if we can't be driven by a dream, by a vision, then we shouldn't be doing what we're doing to end violence against women. We have to be able to imagine that we are able to end the scourge of violence. If we're not able to imagine it, we won't be able to work towards it. And it's about going outside of our boxes, going outside of our heads, going beyond what we are used to and going beyond what we know. So that's Rashida.
Thank you.
Thank you both.
Thanks, Michelle. Thanks to all of you for organizing and sponsoring my participation here.
Sorry, I forgot to say one thing.
Your sponsor.
The sponsor, just because Paula isn't here, but the 100 Ball Stiftung is joining us in this event. Unfortunately, Paula, who is the women's rights manager there, is in Zambia, but we agreed that we will be having feminist seminars with them on a quarterly basis. So, yeah, apologies to 100 Ball Stiftung, but this is a joint event. Thanks.
Thank you to ActionAid and 100 Ball. It did take a bit of time for me to finally get to this meeting that Michelle's been talking about. One of the constraints while I held the position of UN Special Rapporteur was that I had issued a request to the South African government asking for an invitation. And I'm going to talk a little bit about my work over the last 6 years. And so the constraint was coming to a meeting and trying to have frank discussions without me giving my opinions of what is going on in the country is challenging when you are in that position, because the government can attack you because you're not here at the invitation of the government. So it doesn't matter that I'm a South African citizen, that I'm steeped in the history of this country. It doesn't matter when you hold the position of an independent expert in the UN system. And so part of it was a constraint, knowing that I was waiting for the South African government to give me an invitation to come and conduct an official investigation. And the other constraint was, of course, trying to juggle a life doing free work for the UN and trying to survive on teaching part-time at the University of Cape Town. So what I thought I would do, because I need to find a middle way of talking about what I've done in the UN, how it links to the local, and what are the challenges that at the end of 6 years I have picked up. They're global in nature because of the countries I've been to and my own research reports that I've written for different entities in the UN, but they're so applicable to every country context that I go to. I will next week share most of what I'm going to say in a written speech with Michelle so she can share with you. And so I'm going to go in and out of activism and referring to my reports, etc., and hope that that will give us enough substance to talk about contextualizing what I'm saying in the South African scenario. The reason I say that too is, as Michelle has mentioned, the global, local intersection and nexus is so important because our governments, I know there are people that are not South African in the room as well, our governments sign and agree to things in the United Nations, in the African Union, and then at the national level, nothing happens. So we need to be aware. We need to be aware of the obligations that arise from signing a document, an instrument, a treaty, a convention. We need to be aware of that because we need to hold our governments accountable to the promises they've made there. The promises are not promises that they've only made at a national level in our constitution, and where we can see challenges to the fulfillment of those promises. But there's promises and obligations, the legal obligations that they undertake. So that nexus and that link is really important. The other reason that it's really important is the language that you get out of the international and the regional human rights instruments becomes so important for us to use at the national level, so that it's not about our credibility or our legitimacy, but it's being able to argue in a language that your government suddenly realizes we're talking about human rights issues, right? We're not talking about welfare issues when we talk about violence against women. We're not talking about charity issues. We're not talking about this as just a health issue. We're saying there are consequences politically, economically, socially, etc. But using the human rights framework and language in some ways, I think, gives us a leverage when we're trying to hold governments accountable at the national level. So I think that's really important. The third reason why I think this meeting's coming actually at the right time, because I just found out that my successor, the new Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, has agreed, and the government has agreed, and she's coming in December to conduct a mission. So I wasn't good enough to be invited, but let a foreign white woman come. Oh, you need to edit that. So it is, for me as a third generation South African, it's problematic. But on the other hand, it's an opportunity for all of you. So let's think about this meeting strategically as an opportunity of how you can give input, etc. And I'll talk a little bit about how I conducted my country investigations and how you can get this person to look and see, to listen and hear, and make sure that that report reflects the reality on the ground, because that report gets presented to the Human Rights Council in Geneva. It will probably be in June of next year. My mode of working was to present a synopsis of the report to the General Assembly in New York in October each year. And because I also reported to the Commission on the Status of Women in CSW, I also provided some input, especially when there were countries that were problematic and that you wanted the global community. And sometimes it's not about it. For me, it wasn't about naming and shaming. Donor countries, it's important for them to hear. So, I go to Somalia, I go to Afghanistan, I go to Sudan. It's very important for the donor community to know if I see a disconnect, because I'm the unpaid UN independent expert who's looking in. I have no vested interest except recording objectively what the reality on the ground is and making recommendations. And sometimes those recommendations are for the donor community, because they could have priorities that actually don't match the need on the ground. Sometimes the recommendations are for UN agencies. So it's a really important moment that this meeting's taking place for you to think about your engagement with the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, who's coming in December at the invitation of the South African government. I would say, so where does that fall into our mandates? So there are four main kind of requirements in a way through resolutions in the UN of what we should be doing. So the first is to seek and receive information on violence against women, its causes and consequences. Seeking and receiving information could be through these country missions that I was talking about at the invitation of the government. If we don't get an invitation, we can't go into the country to conduct an official investigation. Silence on the part of a government is not yes, it's not acquiescence, so you can't come in. So you have to get that invitation from the government. So seeking and receiving information, one source is through your country investigations. I have conducted in 6 years 19 country investigations, which apparently is the most amongst all the mandate holders. One of the reasons was that I was killing myself. So if I was going to be in Bosnia, I was doing Croatia. So I was doing 2 countries at the same time. I did India and Bangladesh together. I did El Salvador and something together. So anyway, so we have to wait for the invitation of the government. And so we can receive the information from both sides. My way of working was I would spend 60% of my time talking to government authorities, going to government institutions, to seek and receive information. So I go to prisons, I go to detention centers, I go to psychiatric hospitals, I go to shelters, both state-sponsored and non-state-sponsored shelters, and then meet with NGOs as well. So 60% with government entities and individuals, 40% with civil society. So we can get both sides. The other way to seek and receive information is when we receive individual complaints. So individual allegations, either that the violation is by a state authority or by a non-state authority, and the state has failed to protect, to prevent, etc. And so we receive these individual complaints. Sometimes the complaint is drafted by an NGO, legal NGO, service provider NGO, etc. And it would go to Geneva, the complaint, and we do a bit of investigation to get more information on that. The advantage of, and that's a very underutilized mechanism within the special procedure system, which is the human rights system that I fall under. It's very underutilized, and yet it's such an amazing mechanism. To use international human rights law, first you have to show that the country is a party. The country has signed and ratified treaties, conventions, etc. Secondly, you have to exhaust your domestic remedies. So you have to go through the court system, through whatever systems there are in place, before you can send your complaints to a treaty body in the UN. That's the treaty body complaints mechanism. Special procedures mechanism, which is the independent experts, the working groups, etc. You don't have to exhaust your domestic remedies, and your country does not have to be a party to any international instrument, right? So it's very, very useful to know that and to send complaints to the mechanism. We as a group of independent experts, the Special Rapporteur on Torture, myself, arbitrary detention, Special Rapporteur on Trafficking, on culture, have got together when we see a complaint come to us to try and figure out how many human rights violations have occurred. Because violence against women has a whole range of issues. Access to justice issues, torture comes up often in, and not only state-sponsored torture, certain manifestations of violence which amount to torture. Issue of the Special Rapporteur on Housing, battered women and homelessness comes up as an issue. The failure of the state to protect, the failure of the state to prevent. So these are issues. So we would find ways to send a communication that addresses this multiple and intersecting violations that occur. So and then the other way to seek and receive information is being invited by NGOs, by academic institutions to participate in conferences, give talks, and then have input. Sometimes these kind of meetings have served as a catalyst for me to ask for an invitation to go to that country because of what I was hearing and being concerned about. The second thing that we mandated to do as in these positions is to recommend measures, ways, and means at the local, regional, and the local, national, regional, international level. So it's not about pie in the sky recommendations. It's about understanding context, understanding realities, understanding the position of where that country is situated and what would work, and making recommendations that would resonate for people who provide services, who do advocacy work, who do legal work. So, if you come in, and I felt very privileged being an African woman, being from the global south, being Muslim, because it also has implications in certain countries that you go to. It's how you look at that world. And so I have felt really advantaged having all these other identities. I come from poverty, so being able to kind of walk in those shoes has been important. So unless you give us that information, or unless we have a worldview and a lens that we know there's something going on, we're not going to ask the right questions. So it's really important for you to think about, when you have a foreign woman coming, how do you explain the context and reality so that her report, her recommendations reflect that? And I think that's something to take away. Making a recommendation. So, going to Somalia, seeing the disconnect between the donor funding and what is going on the ground, seeing what the needs are. Meeting with the donors and saying this is not adequate. Afghanistan, meeting with the donor community, and having an ambassador say to me, shelters are a new thing for Afghanistan, but shelters are for emergency housing. Why are women staying there 5 years? And my turnaround question is, they can never go back home. They'll get killed. So where do they go? So why aren't you, as a donor community, thinking about second stage housing? You live in UN compounds in Kabul. So how about thinking of gated communities, communal residences where women and their children could live? Because they can never go back home in Afghanistan. So the question isn't, why are they there for 5 years? The question for me, I turn it around to the donor. What are you doing to ensure that women don't have to stay in a shelter? It's not an ideal situation for women and their children. So, so those kind of dialogues take place. Work closely with the treaty bodies. So, once a year I try and meet behind closed doors with the CEDAW committee to talk about what I am finding on the ground, because they are a monitoring body. They're monitoring a treaty. The kind of investigations that we do as special procedures, independent experts, is different. It's not NGO work, but it is different because we have the backing of the UN to do that. Adopting a comprehensive and universal approach. So understanding specificity, but also understanding the universality of violence against women and girls globally. Because I don't think there are different specific manifestations that we may not see. So early enforced marriages, huge issue, Sudan, Afghanistan. We know it's happening here, but is it at the same prevalence levels? Are the manifestations in the same way? Kyrgyzstan in Central Asia, where there's an abduction. It reminded me of Ukutwala when I heard about it. So there's an abduction, which is a kind of cultural, ceremonial thing, and then to use the Zambian word, to deflower the girl, so that then she's spoiled, and then you marry her, right? And you see the universality in these things when you do this work, and you realize, it's not 6 degrees of separation between a battered woman in this country and someone sitting in Afghanistan. There's just different prevalence levels. So adopting this comprehensive universal approach with specificity has been really important for me. Thematic reports. I've also tried during the 6 years to push the boundaries on looking, because the other thing we do is we produce reports. These are plain thematic research reports for the Human Rights Council, for the General Assembly, written reports. And I've tried to look at areas that have been underdeveloped, because there are places and people in the world who you say violence against women and they say domestic violence. They can't think outside of all the other manifestations of violence. I mean, to talk about economic violence that women and girls are subjected to is like bizarre in some country contexts. So it's been important through the thematic reports to push those conceptual understandings for member states, for UN agencies. And the thematic reports are all on the website. But I've looked at issues like how in 2015, my reports to both the General Assembly and the Human Rights Council have been about highlighting that in the international UN system, there's a gap, there's a legal gap, because there's nothing in international law that says that states have an obligation to eliminate violence against women. There are no legally binding obligations. What we have is what we call soft law. So resolutions, declarations, general recommendations from CEDAW. So think about general recommendation 12, 19, 30 on conflict situations. But legally binding that gives rise to state responsibility, no, there's nothing in international law. So the 2015 reports highlight that in the African system, we have the Maputo Protocol that has provisions on violence against women that are underpinned by legal obligations. In the Inter-American system, there's a specific treaty on violence against women, and then in Europe now, we have a Council of Europe treaty on violence against women and domestic violence. But globally, we have nothing. Then there's all the other continents, because Europe, Africa, and the Latin American region are not the world. So we have the rest of the world where there are no regional human rights systems. So I highlight that for the UN, that in the three of the regional systems, Africa, it's not perfect. The Maputo Protocol is not on violence, it's on women, but there are provisions that are progressive. I think we can use them to start a discussion on the African continent about a specific legally binding instrument on violence against women and girls. We need to be including the girls, because in too many countries, though my mandate is women, I cannot ignore the girl child. Whether it's about incest, whether it's about early and forced marriages, whether it's about FGM or other cultural practices that are harmful, the girl child is implicated, whether it's conflict or peace context. In 2014, I tried to push member states to understand that violence against women, the rhetoric is there, and Michelle can tell you this from meetings in New York. Every government will say violence against women is a human rights issue, right? They say it at national level, they say it regional, they say it international. So the challenge is, how do we move beyond the rhetoric of violence against women is a human rights issue? So in the 2014 report, I highlight for governments how violence against women is actually a barrier to the exercise of all human rights: economic, social, cultural, developmental rights, civil and political rights. And more importantly for me, is that violence is a barrier to the effective exercise of citizenship. I cannot be a participatory, functioning, autonomous citizen helping to grow my community, my country, when violence is part of my life. So the citizenship nexus became important. The other issue that I looked at was the issue of women who are incarcerated, whether it's police detention, whether it's immigration detention, whether it's prisons, looking at what are the pathways to women getting incarcerated. What are the what happens while they're incarcerated? What are the consequences for women? And showing that it is differentiated on the basis of gender. So one of my concerns in my country missions was that I saw the numbers of women getting incarcerated rising far more. So the war on drugs, the war on terror, whatever it was, the immigration, more and more women were ending up incarcerated. And you could see it in the numbers. And so I wanted to ask the question, what's the nexus of higher prevalence rates of incarceration to violence against women? So there were women who were being detained and incarcerated on drug-related offenses. They were in abusive relationships. Police come and do a raid, and if you live in the US and the war on drugs and 3 strikes and you're out laws, means that they don't care. They come in, if you are in the household with the drugs, they don't care that it's not yours, that you didn't know about it. No, not their problem. So more and more African American women were being incarcerated for that. Latin American women on the war on immigration, I don't want to call it irregular migration. I think the illegal is the wrong word to use. And so when you start unpacking women in domestic violence situations, women who were battered and used self-defense, women where the police were too lazy to figure out who the primary perpetrator was. Because two people kicking and screaming and saying, she attacked, he attacked, police, I'm not interested, I'm arresting both of you. Police not doing their proper work to identify causes, consequences, primary perpetrators. And so the numbers go up because there's a way of looking at violence against women. Consequences for them, the sexual nature of the assaults that happen in prisons. Whether you're a transgendered woman, whether you're a lesbian woman, whether you're a heterosexual woman. There's a sexual element to the kind of assaults. There's a sexual element to when a camera gets placed in a prison that looks into the women's bathrooms. What is the need for that, right? So there's no privacy. It's part of humiliating you, but it's also part of the sexual gratification of male guards. Consequences for women. When they come out of prison, they probably have lost their children, they've lost the family support, they're more stigmatized. They're told that they're bringing shame into their families and communities, don't come back. So where do they go? Men don't get the same reactions when they come out of prisons. And so we need to think about that more broadly. And the question I ask governments in that report is, are there no other creative options? Why are we incarcerating women? Because we incarcerate people because they're a threat to public safety. 99.9% of women that are incarcerated are not a threat to public safety. So why do we incarcerate? We need to understand why we incarcerate people and which kind of people we incarcerate. I'm not saying no woman should be incarcerated. I'm just saying we need to think about whether that's the best way. Violence against women with disabilities was another report I did, because it's so easy to just think about disability as access issues. And in some countries, it's about forced sterilization, no consent, etc., about their sexual and reproductive health and rights. And so pushing the boundaries and thinking about violence against women with disabilities differently. My reports to those are my reports to the General Assembly in New York. My reports to the Human Rights Council, pushing the argument about the normative gap, that there's a gap in international human rights law on violence against women, and that the regional systems have specific treaties, but we need a global treaty. Inspecting the UN itself. So when I talk about the UN, I'm talking about these 193 member states that are members of the UN. Looking at how, when they sit in that forum of the UN, how do they think about state responsibility and accountability for violence against women and girls? And I did a 20-year reflection, and it's in the 2014 report. And what I call it is 20 years of normativity without legality. So what the UN did over 20 years, the resolutions, the declarations, the soft law developments, no legally binding provisions on violence against women and girls. Those of you that work with violence against women in conflict situations, you know, there's a big rah about 7 Security Council resolutions on women, peace and security. Yeah, it's important. There's no enforcement mechanisms, and there is no legally binding obligations on anyone in those 7 resolutions. So we need to think about that. So the normativity without legality was to highlight to the system itself of the routes that they've taken in terms of violence against women. I dedicated a whole report to state responsibility and how we understand state responsibility as citizens at the national level, but how do we get our governments accountable at the international level when they sign and ratify instruments? I did a whole report on gender-related killings of women. Some of you may use the word femicide. In the Latin American region, they talk about feminicide. In the Arab region, it's honor killings. Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, some of the Pacific Islands, witchcraft-related killings, right? It's like living in the Dark Ages, women being labeled as witches and being killed. And so I used a term which I thought reflected gender-related killings. You killed because you are a woman, right? Again, it came out of a concern. The numbers are going up. And I wanted to highlight 2 member states that the numbers are going up because we failed in our initial response. When women are being battered in different ways, in public, in private, When the state response fails women, the majority of those women are going to end up dead eventually. So if you disaggregated your data and didn't put everything under murder, you would see how many women are killed as a direct result. The nexus is there. So that report was about that. The 2011 report was about multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination against women. My message to governments is a one-size-fits-all approach doesn't work. Women are not a homogeneous group. We are different in so many ways, from our race, our ethnicity, our culture, our language, etc. And so when you come up with a one-size-fits-all approach, you are doing a disservice, and you're never going to reach the goal of elimination of violence against women. So that was my first report in 2010 was reparations for women who've been subjected to violence. And I think about reparations because that's an international law obligation. Protect, prevent, punish, provide effective remedies, including reparations. Now, it's been unfortunate that reparations has become understood as money, compensation. And we in this country have been guilty of that because of our TRC, right? It wasn't the fault of the TRC, let's make that absolutely clear. What it was the understanding that if we pay people compensation, that is enough. The TRC reports are saying very clearly, we need to address the individual, the institutional, and the structural aspects that gave rise to the subordination, the oppression, the discrimination, the inequalities, etc. that we're dealing with. Unfortunately, it got understood as compensation. So my argument there is if we think about this international law obligation that governments have, which is the respect, protect, fulfill framework of international human rights law, then you have to understand reparations. You have to use reparations as a transformative tool to change the reality on the ground. It means addressing the individual that's been harmed. It means addressing the institutional challenges, barriers that individual faces in trying to seek remedies. And then you have to address the structural. Whether the structural is lack of education, access to healthcare, etc., you have to address the structure. So that was one of the reports. So under international law, at the human rights law, we stuck with a position of soft law. And then, as I mentioned, the three regional systems have certain issues. 1993, Vienna Conference on Human Rights, seminal moment. It was only in 1993 that there was this clear, explicit articulation that violence against women is a human rights violation. Imagine that, 1993, which is not that far off. The adoption of the Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women in 1994, important development. The adoption of a resolution to create this post of Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, 1994, so it's one of the older mandates. But where are we at in terms of the understanding? So linking it to the fact that I cannot be an effective citizen, contributing to the development of my family, my community, my country, seeing violence as a barrier is an important, linking it to citizenship, linking it to the fact that you cannot realize all your human rights. Understanding violence against women as a reinforcement of male privilege, patriarchy. Patriarchy is alive and well, we know that. We need to be using the word more often. So violence as a reinforcement of male domination, of control, and how that is linked to women's autonomy, women's bodily integrity, women's their independence, equality, non-discrimination rights. And it's in the home, the community, in the workplace. I look at 4 spheres of violence. Violence in the home, and it ranges from everything, as some people say, garden variety, domestic violence, marital rape, incest. I look at child abuse, etc. I look at violence in the second sphere is violence in the community, all forms of sexual harassment in the workplace, sexual offences in public spaces. Violence that's perpetrated by the state, so in state institutions, prisons, detention centres, etc., and violence that's condoned by the state. That's where the state fails in its duty to protect, to prevent, etc. And then I looked at the transnational, so the issue of refugees, migrants, trafficking victims, etc., has formed part of my mandate. We have to think about violence in how it maintains systemic levels of inequality, of discrimination, etc. And we have to think about how the normalisation of violence, you know, in the South African context, we talk about, well, look at our history. And that kind of normalisation, which means that it's accepted, which means there's no accountability, right? So the lack of accountability means that impunity is the norm rather than accountability for crimes against women. Some of the challenges, the lack of acceptance of violence against women as a human rights violation. So the rhetoric is there, but is it the head and the heart process that violence against women is a human rights violation? And now we have to think of remedies in that way. No, I find that still problematic. I have found state responses are inadequate. That's also problematic. Sometimes there's very much a welfare approach. These poor women, these are our mothers and our sisters. No, this is a human rights issue. They may be our mothers and sisters. We may feel really hard thoughts what's happening, but it's a human rights violation. Because when there's torture going on in police cells, we don't say these are our husbands and brothers and uncles. We say this is torture. And we deal with it on that level. We hold people accountable. So we need to be doing that. So the state response, starting with the health sector, the justice sector, the police, where's your first port of call, etc. The efforts to deal in a comprehensive manner, in a systematic manner with the problem is a challenge that we face, and a sustained manner. So this is not about 16 days of activism. It's not about the rhetoric of 360, it's about that sustained attention to what is a pervasive, systemic, widespread issue. And it affects countries that have been in conflict, that are in conflict, and we need to think about it. The time, the effort, the resources that we put into the problem. I think if we demanded a disaggregated budget and looked at how little resources go into work on women's human rights broadly, but violence against women and girls in particular, it will be shocking. Inadequate attention to investigating the patterns, the causes, the consequences of violence. Because we don't do it in a systematic way. So the NGOs do their thing. They have statistics that don't match the state statistics. They may come together and talk about it a bit, but it's not comprehensive, it's not sustained, it's not systematic. Underreporting for a variety of reasons. For those of you that are service providers, you have one bad reaction at the police who says, oh, please, this is just a domestic matter, go kiss and make up. Or the priest says, he's your husband. Religion demands that you stay with your husband. Or your family says, don't bring disgrace to the family by airing your dirty linen. That's all it takes for women not to use the systems that are in place and not to make the systems work. Very few prosecutions. We know that, right? Because in a country with high crime rates, that's not a priority. Crimes against women and girls and children broadly. Very few convictions and sentencing patterns which reflect that these crimes are not taken seriously. We know this, we've seen the issues. Not addressing the individual harm, the institutional challenges, and the structural barriers to effective remedies and responses is something that we need to think about. In the 2014 reports, I highlight about 6 or 7 areas that I found were consistently familiar for almost all parts of the world that I've been to. Someone said to me that she thinks I didn't go to Greenland, Antarctica, that part of the world, but I covered most. And it was, again, coming from where I come, I wanted to make sure that I wasn't picking on certain countries. Very easy to get into a pattern of picking on certain African countries, certain Asian countries, certain Muslim majority countries, and say, violence against women doesn't happen anywhere else. For those of you that's interested, Google me after my mission to the United Kingdom. Oh, the media was vicious, because who was this woman coming to tell the UK that they had a problem with violence against women and girls? The media was really vicious. But anyway, so some of the things that I've seen, there's been a shift, and it's in no particular order. There's been a shift to gender neutrality in many countries, in laws, in policies, in programs. Now that is a huge challenge, because for those of you who can remember, we had women in development, but the empowerment of women was huge on the radar of donors, of governments, etc., and NGOs themselves, right? So we had the specificity that was needed to deal with women's human rights, violence against women, etc. But there's been a shift to neutrality. So we went to gender mainstreaming. I think even the UN doesn't know what gender mainstreaming is, quite frankly. It's become all things to all people and meaningless in most contexts. And it's something we need to think about. But there's been this shift to gender neutrality, that we have to treat everyone the same, because that's what equality means. No, under international human rights law, the imperative, the obligation is substantive equality. So you have to take specificity into account, you have to take difference into account, and you have to provide the remedies with that understanding. So the concept of gender neutrality has meant that we are going back, and some of the Nordic countries have already gone back, to a system of achieving formal equality as opposed to substantive equality. And that is really dangerous when your donors are coming from the global north with that ideology and that thinking, right? Because they're bringing it into context where we haven't even started talking about women's empowerment and specificity. And I found that really dangerous. Try highlighting that with the donor community, donor countries, and it's tough. So it means that there's been the shift to formal equality, which means substantive equality is out the window, and it's being appropriated and adopted by countries that haven't even reached the starting block of women's empowerment. We need to go back to a women's empowerment approach. We need to make sure women have the tools, the knowledge, the access, the resources, the opportunities to become active agents in their own lives. We can't do rescue. That's not what the struggle was about. It's not about rescuing people. It's about giving people the tools to become active agents in their own lives. If we apply neutrality to violence against women, it means male victims of violence require the same attention and the same resources as violence against women. Now just think in your head about statistics. Think about the underpinnings that are linked to violence against women: inequality, oppression, discrimination, subordination. Those factors are not necessarily part of the experience of men. The prevalence rates are nowhere near the same. But because of the gender neutral thinking, we have to apply an equality framework, same resources, etc. So it ignores the reality of women's lives. It ignores the prevalence, the manifestations, the underpinnings, the causes, the consequences, and it shifts to that. The other issue that I picked up was quite common across the globe is the issue of the persisting public-private dichotomy in the responses to violence against women. And it simply means that when we deal with harms that individuals suffer in the public sphere, so two men fighting on the street, the response of the justice system is different. When the police respond, when they come to break up a fight, when they come to arrest people, it's different than when it happens behind closed doors. Because behind closed doors, it's expected that's private, deal with it, right, the response. So the public-private dichotomy can apply to a whole range of issues, but the response is different and we have to think about that. Then the public-private dichotomy, think about the gender pay gap. Nowhere in the world is there parity in salaries. In the US, it's 87 cents to the dollar at the moment. I think in the UK, I think women earn 30% less than men do. So the gender pay gap, and how does that reinforce women's inequality, discrimination, ability to become active agents in their own lives is a challenge. The double burden of production and reproduction for women. You know, I call it the triple shift. It's the children, it's the work, it's the domestic, and women have these other responsibilities in certain societies to the community, to the extended family, etc. And the shifts just become more and more, and women juggle all this. And that's a public-private issue because the state is not intervening in any way to ensure pay parity, that men take responsibility also for children, or that we have good childcare facilities so that women can become economically active, viable, and active agents. In some countries, there are laws and systems of guardianship. Think Saudi Arabia, think of some of the Arab countries, that actually precludes women's autonomy, their movement, their freedom of expression, freedom of opinion. And sometimes it's not the law, it's social practices, right? So again, there's a difference to what we want women to be in public and how we either allow and give opportunities or how we preclude. We can use the law, we can use social constraints, and we add violence to that to make sure that we can keep this persisting public-private dichotomy. The normalization of violence is something we need to think about. Another issue that's global in character is the failure of states to act with due diligence. Due diligence as a duty of care that you owe people to eliminate violence against women. In my report, I argue that the state has a dual responsibility. The state has a responsibility to the individual that's been harmed. So individual, a responsibility to act with due diligence, to protect, to prevent, to punish, to provide effective remedies. But the state has a second responsibility, which I see as a systemic due diligence obligation, which is to have a coherent, comprehensive, sustained system to address protection, prevention, punishment. I also argue in that report that the state has an obligation, and why I hold the state accountable for even private acts by non-state actors is that the state has a responsibility to me as a citizen to protect, to prevent. And when the state fails to protect and prevent, to protect against and to prevent harm, then the state is responsible, not for the direct perpetration of the harm, but responsible for failing in its duty to me as a citizen. And so, if the state understood its responsibility through a dual lens, the state has to hold state authorities accountable for failures to protect and prevent. Now, almost every country I go, I say, when the police or the prosecutor or the judge fail in their duties, what is the system? All of them have internal disciplinary systems. Now, who polices the police, right? How do you do accountability? The lack of transformative remedies that address the root causes, and again, it's that individual, institutional, structural. How do we deal? And I don't think there are any states that have come up with plans for transformative remedies that address it at these three levels. So the kind of never again. If you did transformative remedies, then part of it is non-repetition, all right? To make sure that this doesn't happen. So where is the never again in violence against women work? That's not happening. Taking historical context, taking current realities, taking women's individual situations into account is part of transformative remedies. We don't do that. A holistic framework, protection, prevention. It's not about setting up a one-stop center and saying that's a holistic framework. No, that isn't. That is about getting all the service providers in one place under one roof. But it is not anywhere near the understanding of what a holistic framework is. I propose a holistic framework, I think, in my 2011 report. The other thing that I have found in line with these transformative remedies, but it straddles others, is creation of hierarchies of violence against women and girls. There was a time when trafficking was on the radar. It was a new sexy subject. All the money was going into it. New NGOs were being created. Now it's sexual violence in conflict situations, right? So we're creating these hierarchies of harm. But what we're not thinking about is that violence functions on a continuum. So the violence we see in conflict situation doesn't come out of nowhere one day. Someone got up and decided this is an opportune time to violate women. It's part of an existing pattern of violation of women's human rights. So the continuum gets lost. And so we privilege certain manifestations. It means that political support, ideologies, funding starts shifting, right? When we create hierarchies. And we don't think about the low-level warfare that women in African Network meeting that I had. They talk about the everyday low-level warfare that they face in their homes, in their communities, by the state, etc. So we don't think of it in that way because we want to think of the gory and the bloody and the whatnot as opposed to the everyday unacceptable that we should be talking about. The understanding of gendered responses, and in a way it's linked to gender neutrality, but this move towards a focus on men and boys. I have a whole section on that in my report. I know people are struggling with this because the donors are telling you that's where the money is. You just have to introduce these programs. It's a huge problem because the understanding of men as allies, of men who supported the feminist struggles, for me means that men joined the women's rights organizations. But that didn't happen, and it's not happening in many parts of the world. So men are setting up their own organizations. They've got the political support, they've got public spaces, they've got the money, and they are stealing staff from NGOs because they pay better salaries and give them more perks like, go to Geneva and New York, etc. But what has been lost in that understanding is the shift is not about, when we talk about educating men and boys, it's about the experts on their lives, the battered women, the service providers, etc., doing that. Not about men and boys setting up their own organizations, so within the understanding that only men and boys can talk to men and boys. Because what are the messages that are being perpetrated? We don't know. Are there new forms of patriarchy being created behind closed doors in these organizations? The other thing is that instead of talking about women as autonomous beings with rights, we start talking about we need to speak for women. So women are victimized again in this discourse. Women are not seen as autonomous human beings. Look at the websites of some of these programs and look at who's speaking on behalf of women and the language that they use. It's not, they have monopolized the feminist language in some ways and they sanitized it. Look at the programmatic activities. And so my plea for researchers and service providers, and I've said this to the World Health Organization in a talk I gave a few weeks ago, someone needs to be interrogating more scientifically these men and boys programs. The impact, because so many women's rights organizations have shut down, so many good women's rights activists have left the work and have moved into these spaces. What are the messages that are going out? Who's speaking on behalf of women? And is this another way of victimizing women to keep women in their place? And then conflating the interests of men and boys with the interests of women and girls. Oh, we are all similarly situated because we live in oppressive situations. Stereotypes apply to men and women, so And I think these are the wrong arguments. So there's a section there in my report, which is a starting point of a discussion. And what did not surprise me is not a single, and one of the things in the research I did was to look for who are the usual suspects coming to the UN, speaking in the national level media and international media. There are 5 men globally, 2 in this country, who are the mouthpieces of the men and boys movement. And we need to ask, so 5 people have created, as men in many contexts have done, in government, out of government, have created this myth about this huge thing. Yes, the Million Men March, etc., but this myth about the 1 million good men. And so then the question is, why are the prevalence rates going up? So we need to challenge these things. Financial crisis, and in the global north, it's called austerity measures, blah, blah. where does government first start cutting? Social services. Not the military budget, not the, the gravy trains of security, etc. Social services. So core service provision, legal services, advocacy work. And then what I have picked up also is, if you're a women's rights NGO that is more vocal, you get punished by not getting funded. So this reprisal against women's human rights defenders is another pattern I've seen in some countries. So we need to be keeping an eye. I think we're going in this country into a deeper financial crisis. So some of the things that I've seen in the last 2.5, 3 years in the global north, and it is horrendous. Read the UK report of how the outsourcing, the localism as they call it, the funds to social services spending is impacting Black minority ethnic women in particular. Because white women in the UK, most of them, I think, have other options, family, other resources. It's impacting Black minority ethnic women in the UK, and I was very critical of that. I've spoken about the fact that there are no legally binding obligations for states to eliminate violence against women. And remember, I'm saying legally binding obligations, so there's soft law developments. No legally binding, so there's a normative gap. My recommendation is we need, at the international level, a treaty, a standalone treaty on violence against women and girls with its own monitoring body. Because then it's specific, it's like the torture committee. That's the issue you're looking at. And your engagement with states means that you're not talking about the 16 articles in CEDAW. You bring in equality, you bring in non-discrimination, you bring in dignity, but you're looking at a state's record on violence against women in a very specific, specialized way with a specialized body. I think that's pie in the sky, unless the civil society around the world can support that. I don't think my successor would be keen on that because she was part of developing the Council of Europe Convention. And people who've been involved in the European Convention actually have no problem saying to someone like me that why can't that convention become the global convention? But no. As an African, I don't want to be colonized by Europe again. So, something developed in Europe for a European context by Europeans. Now they say, oh, yeah, it's a good instrument. That I will acknowledge. From a pragmatic perspective, it can be a good starting point. The Inter-American, the Council of Europe Conventions, the Maputo Protocol. We look at all that and come up with something that's applicable globally, but where you and I have had the opportunity to input as well. Not something that Europe, fosters on us. So where are we now? So those are some of the challenges. And when you think about the challenges, I think our mothers and grandmothers would tell us, yeah, we also spoke about that. So the public-private dichotomy, how we deal with violence against women as a private matter that affects certain kind of people, the silencing, the failures of the justice system. These are all things that are not new. But I tried to kind of bring it into a report to say, these are all existing things. So there are international challenges, there are regional challenges, there are national level challenges. And I'm hoping, Michelle can talk a little bit about national level and where do we shift this? Because we can't go on talking about violence against women and girls, complaining, keeping our statistics, saying our funding is cut when we are dealing with a huge structural issue. Just looking at the student protests in the last 2 weeks, I've had students, and next week I have to meet with a group of women students who were talking about in the residences, when they raised their voices, that we need to be talking about the gendered aspects of university life as well. And they were told, no, let's deal with the race thing. Don't take this to another level. I heard this in the late 80s when we were talking about a constitution for this country, the Women's Coalition. I was part of the Women's Coalition, developing the charter, etc. But it was about, let's focus on race. Gender will come. It'll never come. Will violence come? The rhetoric will come. We're going to go into 16 days of activism. How do you do? I see my country mission reports as an accountability tool. Because I go into a country, it can range from 10 days to 3.5 weeks. My US visit is quite long, big country. But then I leave. So I listen to all of you. I get reports from you. I leave. You are the citizens that hold your country, your government accountable. How do you use a country mission report as an accountability tool? What do you do with it? Now, this mandate has come to this country. The special rapporteur, the first special rapporteur on violence against women came. She looked at the narrow issue of violence, sexual offences. So there is a report, 1996 or 97 or something. How do you, in your preparations for the next visit in December of my successor, how do you prepare? How do you use that report as an accountability tool to first, for yourself, think about, so what's changed? Have things, of course, as I said, the limitation of that report is it looked at rape largely. But how do you look at that and look at what's going on in 2015 that you're able to produce something for this new mandate holder to think? Is it same old, same old? Has the problem worsened? And we are talking about a democratic government because she came after democracy. And so how do you then link it? Because we can't say, oh, this used to happen in apartheid times, right? We have to link it back. We have to look at what's changed. So think about the reports as accountability tools that you use in your national context to hold your government accountable. Because as citizens, that's your responsibility, to hold your government accountable. You have to hold the institutions and mechanisms that were set up to deal with women's human rights accountable. Because their salaries are paid by your tax, right? And so as citizens, you have that responsibility as well. We have an amazing constitution. To have a provision in your constitution that says that you have a right to be free from all forms of violence, both public and private, that's pretty unique. We were the kind of the leaders in that. Now there are more constitutions that include. But that gives you the space also to use. There's been litigation. Public impact litigation is important, but I think we also need to think about who benefits, right? Is it the litigant in that party? Is there a larger change that goes on after public impact litigation? When Parliament opens its doors, not like last week where they shut their doors, couldn't hear a thing. Students were screaming and stunned and ex-parliamentarians couldn't hear that. How do you, when you make your submissions to Parliament, how do you hold? We don't have a constituency-based system formally. Informally, we supposedly have representation. But how do you hold Parliament accountable, parliamentarians accountable? How do you interrogate the budgets? How much of money is actually going? And don't make it a technocratic, technical exercise that's just about numbers and number crunching. Because numbers can tell stories, and you need to get into disaggregating data that tell stories. So the numbers telling the stories so that people's lived realities don't, come up with a scientific number document only. How do we do that? That's part of accountability. And for me, that's the message that I leave everywhere I go, is how do you understand accountability? Accountability at all levels, because as service providers, as policymakers, advocacy people, you're also accountable to a constituency. So how do you hold yourself accountable to the constituency that you serve? Do your, say, people that do advocacy work, do your research report reflect what is a burning issue for women and girls in that country? Or is it because some donors said, here's money if you work on this issue? Where's the accountability in that? At what stage do women's human rights organizations that have really been suffering because of the reprisals, because of the funding cutbacks, because of staff being taken by the richer NGOs, when do they stand up and say, no? I mean, in the UK, the women's rights organizations that run shelters refuse to give up the shelters, so they're doing voluntary work again. This is the UK. They're doing voluntary work again in the shelters. They've started a system of people working 2 days and 2 days, so job sharing, and these examples are being used to highlight to the government that when you cut social spending, this is what happens. Social services spending, this is what happens. And it's all part of accountability. And then, for me now, and I mean, I've been sitting in a university, but there's 6 years in the UN, which finished in July. I felt like I had the best of all worlds because I was doing this investigative work, I was doing the research for thematic reports, but I was teaching. So I could infuse my teaching with what I was seeing in the real world to get my students, in a way, to conscientize the students to think about human rights issues, to think about women's human rights issues in a different way. I had one Irish student 2 years ago who said, Prof, the more I come to your seminars, the more I hate being a man. And I said, oh, good, you get it. But that's not my objective in teaching, but it's about getting them to think about women's lives, girls' lives differently. I know I've been very long, and I hope I haven't been too much of a teacher, but my hope is that we, at the end of October, you have like 4 weeks before the new mandate holder comes, to think about some of these issues and be more nuanced in your interactions and engagements with them. Thank you very much.
Comrades, colleagues, a lot was offered. 3 issues were pointed into in terms of moving forward. We have the session up until 3 o'clock. I will not take questions at this point. I will allow Nish to speak for 20 minutes. That should take us until 12, so up until shortly before 1, so that when we come back from having our short break, we can then get into an interactive space in terms of Q&A.
Right. So, Rashida, so just going back to the earlier context that I sketched this morning about how this work, where it fits in for ActionAid and linking our local work to the global. In 2014, before I went to the Commission on the Status of Women meeting in March, we had a small meeting here with a number of NGOs looking, for me, which has been a critical question. How are women living in poverty that we are working with benefiting from international or global advocacy, so that we do at a place like CSW? Can women benefit? And I remember when I first asked Rashida in 2013, I'm thinking, ActionAid has got people going to CSW, should I know? And the message was, shut up, learn and listen. I tried to do that because, it's huge. It was my first time, like everything is big. You can be completely lost and overwhelmed and not know what's going on. And some other donors said, oh no, but our staff don't go to the UN anymore. We send community people. And although that's a very noble idea, but can you imagine what it's like for a community person going into a space like that, not with a group of people, maybe as an individual with 2 people, not understanding the processes, where all this language, whatever things are being used, where we're discussing all the time about an outcomes document. So for me, it was, if we're taking women or anybody there, and it is not an empowering process, then there's no point. And so for me, it is very important to learn. There are games being played there. So you have to learn who's who in the Zoom, who's playing what game. Unfortunately, that's what it's come to when you're talking about gender equality. And so ActionAid International, with a number of countries, have had representation at the Commission on the Status of Women meetings. I think the first meeting, I actually was invited by Unthinkable in Brutality, working on violence against women, to speak at their panel on the strategies and tactics on ending violence against women. The Minister of Social Development at the period, she was there. Yeah, she was there as well. But what's surprising, but what happens there is that our government goes and reports on the status of women in this country. And of course, glowing reports, although we have a pandemic. People talk about the TCC, the Tutuzela Care Centers, and how great that is. And luckily, when Noma had a Sabisa seminar, I could say, well, one of our partners, Shukumisa, did research onto the zero says this is actually not that great. Actually, it's not working.
It's not.
You know. So we continue to talk about the constitution, the wonderful legislation, all of that. But we're not talking about the reality of its lives. And for me, that's critical. And we have to, as Action A, for me, in terms of, we have to interrogate ourselves. Is it work? So even Action A, we have looked at the document, but for me, I'm never focused when there was that is what we're looking at. I took one walk in the UN building and looked at from 1948, even up until today, the UN Secretary Generals, they're all men. So for me, the question is, so why do we want to be surprised about an outcomes document? Why do we want to put all our energy and our efforts into an outcomes document talking about how we're going to resolve, like Rashida spoke about the rhetoric? It doesn't go anywhere. For me, that space has become significant because it's a space where feminist activists from across the world come together in one place. Where otherwise, no one would be finding me to go all over the world to meet with feminists. And in fact, that is a place where we started a very specific lobby around violence against women. So, as Action Aid Women's Rights South Africa, we've been invited to be part of the International Network on Violence Against Women, coordinated by Masimanyane Women's Support Center, and the strategic meeting was this year, was in the August? Yeah, in East London. That space, or that collective, came out of that space, where feminists were discussing about how we continue to be marginalized in the space. All NGOs are losing space. About what are the discussions there about? There was a particular concern around LGBTI rights being marginalized all the time in the UN. So how serious is the UN about ending violence against women? I mean, and when Rashida spoke about her mission reports, it was very clear, it's not just in South Africa. You know, we have a lot of similarities across the world. And what, maybe I shouldn't say shocking, but interesting to see, in all the 3 years that I've been to CSW, and I've attended all of Rashida's panel discussions, I was the only South African, not one single other South African. So in 6 years, you weren't invited as a special rapporteur. And I thought, or I would assume that as South Africa, we would have a specific commitment to the political world to end violence against women. I feel that we don't. I very strongly feel that. I went to one of the first meetings where we discussed the UN Security Resolution 1325, which is about violence against women in conflict situations. And I thought, wow, actually, this wouldn't have related to South Africa because we're not a country in conflict. But then when I heard the discussions, this is actually about us because there is actually a war against women in this country. And when I shared my op-ed that I've written out recently with one of my colleagues, she said it was good and very interesting, but she cautioned around using the language of war. And I immediately actually started writing a whole response because how are we actually going to get people to take violence against women and girls seriously in this country? Because we're not. So for me, I don't know if war will help, if that will bring some awareness, some consciousness, but we're acting like we are unable to end the violence. I mean, in that paper I quote about the defense budget. I don't even want to say, I've worked in the area of violence against women, I think, for 20 years. It's just gotten worse, no matter how we talk about it. And we continue to ignore the reality. And even as NGOs, I'm not just talking about government here, we continue to do the same old. We're not working together, we're all in our silos, and we are not wanting to step out of the boxes. We continue to do what we know, what's comfortable. And having what I've learned from my colleagues in India, and I think I want to say that, the respect I have, no matter what happens in India, is the colleagues that I've known in the international Courts of Women movement. They have been doing the same thing for 25 years or more. The same thing. There's no thing about status and power. It's about what needs to be done. What is needed at that moment. When I visited India, I visited Action Aid countries, Action Aid offices in Mumbai, Bangalore, and in Delhi. In Bangalore is where the organization that is the base, formed the basis of the Courts of Women and the Asian Women's Human Rights Council. The organization was called Vimochana. That organization was started in 1979 by Corinne Kumar. In 1979, they were talking about making violence against women. And we are here, how many years? And we're talking about gender equality. As far as I'm concerned, that's bullcrap, because it's not taking us anywhere. So, for me, I see this as an opportunity that Rashida spoke about the rapporteur. If you didn't tell us now, I wouldn't have known that there's a special rapporteur on violence against women coming to visit this country.
Well, I didn't know either.
Where is she coming to?
The government, she gets invited. So Rashida rightly asked, well, you did have a date for last year, didn't you?
Twice, the government cancelled on me twice. They postponed. So I was issued an invitation, and then they wouldn't set a date. And then on 2 occasions, we had dates we were set, including of May of this year before I went to Sudan. And they just said, the minister has decided that this is not the right time. I can't argue with the minister. And there was, at least to the credit of the civil society, or some of them, that there were letters sent to Parliament protesting to the Women's Ministry saying, why are we not allowing the Special Rapporteur to come? What is more important to know? So that's to the credit. I did not know because Geneva did not inform me that the visit was taking place in December. Talk about respect after serving the UN for 6 years. Not even an email saying the new rapporteur will be doing a mission. And neither was I informed by the rapporteur herself, who I have been doing. I'm still finishing up my Sudan and Caribbean reports and things, so we've been in touch. Leslie Ann Foster informed me that she got an email from Geneva asking if she would help with civil society meetings in South Africa, because when I was supposed to come, she had agreed to be like a focal point. And so she sent me an email saying, what do I do? So I don't know anything. Very interesting.
Very interesting times. Who works in December around here? I would like
well,
to know.
that's what I'm worried about. How fruitful will the visit be? So those of you that are interested, I can leave the email address of the assistant in Geneva that you all should be asking the question, what are the dates, where is she going, which provinces, and who is she meeting with? I think these are important questions for you all to be asking. So we'll put it up for you.
So, yeah. So for me, I mean, it's actually, I think it's, I started in 2013. And I don't think we could have, I think that Rashida spoke about the timing. I think this is the right time. We couldn't have known what we know now. And we wouldn't have been in the position to even just critically look at where we are at in South Africa in 2030. Even the work that we've done now with the Rainbow Activist Alliance, Black lesbian women in townships, with the sexual violence against girls in schools project, with the young urban women. So all of the projects within the Women's Rights Program has an element around issues of violence against women and girls. And what has been very interesting for us, and I think critical, is the lessons around working with women. And so, I was thinking a lot. I'm busy writing an opinion piece, and I was especially also around what happened over the last couple of weeks. And I was thinking, there was, even in fact, when I came for this job interview for ActionAid, I had to write a summary of an analysis of the women's movement. And even then I said, this thing that we continue to talk about, the women's movement is fragmented, the women's movement is dead, the women's movement is weak. What is the women's movement? Because we have this thing in our heads of a big national amorphous thing, like the Women's National Coalition. And when I thought about it again, I thought that, in fact, the Women's National Coalition wasn't sustainable, no matter how we would like to glorify it. There was something amiss. Young women in particular were marginalized and excluded. I think the way in which issues of race were dealt with was superficial, otherwise we wouldn't have been having the kind of conversations or not talking about issues of race. And very much driven by the NC, Women's League, which, yeah.
I'm going to stop the show. I'm going to be 60 this year. So one of the things we need to recognize, coalitions, networks, mobilization. It's about issue-based. It's time and place. And then we need to let go. Because when we hang on and try to recreate those things, it's like the students' movements now, freeze, labor rights, etc. I'm sure in 2 years' time they're going to be. So we need to contextualize. There were lots of gaps and shortchanging, but look at 89 onwards, trying to build a sort of coalition across our political divides in a context where the geographic divides were so big. So there were gaps. So we need to think about it in terms of time and space. But the one thing that I, as an elder now, will say is that we haven't done sufficient work with young people. We haven't brought the young women on board in the way that we should have done for the sake of sustainability and growing, but also for us learning from the gaps and things like that.
And so for me, the significant, I think I've been very privileged to be in Action Aid in this position at a time when we started working with young women in urban areas, which we haven't done before. I think we have learned so much from the young women themselves. So I was in the UK for 2 weeks, which was too long, but with Ajax, who's from the Rainbow Activist Alliance, actually from Orange Farm, traveling across London to talk about the Action Aid UK campaign on violence against women called Fearless. And what I've seen, which I actually was shocked, which I thought was never possible, every time we're talking about organizing and mobilizing women and the lack of political consciousness. And there was very little political consciousness when we started with the Rainbow Activist Alliance. Many of the lesbian women, there were discussions, am I lesbian, am I bisexual, what am I, who am I? And what came out now, she clearly, in all of those forums said, I'm a Pan-Africanist, black, lesbian woman. It wasn't something that she pulled out of her hat. There was a particular political consciousness that she has embraced. And I think, for me, that is about how we work with young men. Not how many, like donors. I was saying to them, you want 450, you want 1,000, you want 2,000. It's about the quality of the work, what kind of work and how we are working. So what I've learned from my sisters in India is, Corinne always says, asking the walk. We don't have to have the answers. It is about the openness, the willingness, and the commitment to do what needs to be done.
Comrades, colleagues, a lot has been said in thinking through around human rights issues and thinking through about specific structures within the UN. And I think it's important that we contextualize our struggle. We're in South Africa with our black-led government 20 years on. I do understand the sympathy of reflecting and seeing systems that have been set up, which was largely the first decade of transformation in South Africa. But it is time to account. It is time to reflect, and it is time to actually reflect on ourselves, also in terms of what we are doing. I think Prof did well in unpacking more broadly in terms of what do we mean when we talk about violence against women, and she made a lot of examples. And I like when she said, we need to consider that it's not about welfare, it's not about health, that we need to consider socio-economic, social-political, civil and political rights. And she further added that, when we talk about violence against women, we also need to think about it as a barrier to effective participation with regards to citizenship. And for me, my contract is still in sex complaints, but when it comes to human rights, I'll also say it's the politics of Me Too, right? It's the politics of including others who are not. And it becomes a confrontation when we have to talk about the legalities of it, who has access to it. So one of the things that I really found quite progressive in the presentation was when Prof talked about the lack of transformative remedies. Because I think if we are to continue with the work that we're doing within the human rights, at the very least, we need to keep that in the back of our heads, that it should not just be about including the working class within systems that are benefiting the elite and the middle class, but thinking about ways that are quite transformative. I was also quite a bit confused. I'm hoping that when we get into the Q&A, what are the differences between the formal equality and substantive equality? Because a lot of us use the word empowerment in our programs, in our campaigns, and all of that. But what do we mean by that? I got clarity today when Prof talked about gender neutrality and talking also about the responses. So she didn't just talk about the structures and the roots to it, but we also talked about the responses with regards to what does it mean to actually talk about men? What does it mean to work with men, to talk with men, to live with men, when we're actually saying we're working towards violence against abuse. Mish came in foregrounding Action Aid's work in terms of the 3 projects, but also highlighting the challenges. I've never been to the UN. I find it very intimidating. Quite often I ask myself, does it really matter? And this is the conversation we're having today. What is the relevance of these structures in our own context? Because we know our governments, it's not just an issue of violence against women. There is an issue of service delivery. There is an issue of lack of Black love. That's how we put it. As a young Black woman in South Africa, that is not there when we have to talk about integrity, when we have to talk about dignity, when we have to talk about a we in terms of our own nation states. But it's not about me, colleagues. Let's please have some snacks. The time now is 12:50. If you could please be back by 1:15, so we can at least have an hour and some few minutes in engaging what has been offered today. Amandla. It's Friday, guys. Let's not be tired.